A number of years ago, one afternoon in San Francisco, I first heard Robert Hass read his poems. He had then recently published his first collection, Field Guide. The reading that afternoon was in one of those nondescript academic classrooms, the sort of classroom we're all familiar with. And what struck me about the poems was their openness to the world that lay outside that room. Poems uncommonly receptive to the exacting, lovely names of things. Flora and fauna called as presences into his work and thereby into that room. The first collection, Field Guide, and it was certainly that, but a poet's field guide. Felt knowledge, and a sure sense that prior to the poems, a man had lived with and in the body of the world until it had become a part of the, quote, the quick pulse of blood through living flesh, unquote. This quick pulse was at the center of the poems. Love poems as well, in which the other could be called the body of my world, root and flower. And poems also that noted the greed and rapacity of history, of napalm manufactured in the fog of Redwood City, and yet placed this awareness against an imaginative order, a small country named Clarity or Passion, just north of Mendocino on the coast. And so clarity and passion take roots, not an imaginary place, but an imaginative one. The distinction seems to me important because it reveals a resistance to yield to the temptation of human desire that is full of endless distance and blurred reverie. The context is not nostalgia or the language of elegy, not things seen as, quote, a tragic falling off from a first world of undivided light, unquote, but rather the sure sense that there are moments when the body is as numinous as words. And it is here, perhaps, that one encounters the richest complexity of Hass's work. Poems that move back and forth between the world's plenitude and its emptiness. A reflective process that leads in one poem to the image of a single peach painted by Georgia O'Keeffe, and finds there, quote, all the fullness that there is in light, unquote. What seems most reductive is finally most ample, and also most sufficient in life as in art. And it's not an accident that Robert Hass has written one of the most thoughtful essays on Rilke, a poet of large angelic orders, and also one of the most thoughtful essays on the haiku, one of the most severe forms. One often hears that contemporary poetry has foundered in a kind of chaos, that the groundbreaking work of a generation of modernist fathers has either been abandoned or trivialized. It seems to me that the poems of Robert Hass are a clear indication that what was bequeathed to us has been put to use. From Williams, the stubborn clarity of image, the capacity to find the materials of poetry in what is commonplace or homely, poems that invite the lowly horse parsnip and the simplicity of a clean kitchen into their imaginative order. And from Stevens, that extended, exclusive music that turns upon the meditation of art and life where they touch, and they touch everywhere. And there's more than that as well in this you're about to hear. Thank you, Peter, a lot. We read together on that day in that classroom in San Francisco. It was one of the first poetry readings I ever gave. I was quite terrified. Peter had this magnificent calm and depth that is in his voice that even makes my poems sound good described. He said that my poems are not nostalgic. I worry that they are, and I was visited a while ago by a singer in a dream, and the dream kept coming back to me, and the words of the singer got clearer and clearer. He was playing an instrument of some kind. It looked like a flute made out of bone or something like that. And finally, I don't remember whether this happened in the dream or in reverie or something like that, he said to me, you hollowed out the flute of longing. Yes, you did, was the first message. And then the second message was, you made it out of fear and sorrow. And then the third part of the message was, and it was said to me accusingly, and you played the dreams song. Like I had done something terribly wrong. Yes, you did. And I knew it was wrong to play the dreams song. And the form that took, what for me at that moment in my life, was the way that the world often comes to me in stranded images. If you write poems, I don't know if it's the way that it happens to other people, but it is often the way that it happened to me. And it started to disturb me, like I was digging myself this grave of nostalgia, because the world would. In fact, I had just seen Phil on a street corner in New York, and I was wandering away from the 8th Avenue bookstore, and it was a kind of gray day, and I was standing at a traffic island watching these people, and the phrase that came into my head was, and others on corners, I can't remember what the verb was now, something pestered, battered by the wind, and went around working with that for days. Not a sentence, and others on corners, pestered by the wind, or something. And I started to feel like I couldn't stand it anymore, that the world came to me in phrases. So anyway, these poems, I'm going to read from a sequence of poems that try to address this question. The first one is sort of complicated as a result. And they're called, the group is called, I'll read about 6 of them, and the group is called The Spring Drawings. A man says lilacs against white houses, having seen them in the farm country south of Tacoma in April, and can't find his way to a sentence. A brushstroke carrying the energy of brush and stroke, as if he were stranded on the aureole of the memory of a woman's breast, and she, after the drive from the airport and a chat with her mother and a shower, which is ritual cleansing, and a passage through water to mark transition, walked up the mountain
on a summer evening. Away from, not toward. Because the garden roses seemed like a little hobby of the dead. Because she felt sure that the deer pellets, the wavering moon, the ronger, they used to say, upping the ante, of heaven, were admirable completely, but only as common nows of a plainer intention. Ship, moon, sky, as if spirit attended to plainness only, the more complicated forms exhausting it, tossed off grape stems, becoming crystal chandeliers, as if radiance were the meaning of meaning, and just as responsible to daydream, not only for the strict beauty of denial, but as a felt need to reinvent the inner form of wishing. Only the force of the brushstroke keeps the lilacs from pathos. The he's and she's of the comedy may or may not get together, but if they are to get at all, then the interval created by if, to which mind and breath attend, nervous as the grazing animals the first brushes painted, has become habitable space, lived in, beyond wishing. And the second of these is called Buying the Wine. And this is my New York City poem. My kids call it my Woody Allen poem. They had agreed, walking into the delicatessen on 6th Avenue, that their friends' affairs were focused and saddened by massive projection. Movie screens in their childhood were immense, and someone had proposed that need was unlovable. The delicatessen had a chicken salad with chunks of cooked chicken in a creamy basil mayonnaise, a shade lighter than the Coast Range in August. It was gray outside, February, eating with plastic forks, walking and talking in the sleety afternoon. They passed a house where Juna Barnes was still, reportedly, making sentences. Basho said, "Avoid adjectives of scale. You will love the world more and desire it less." And there were other propositions to consider. Childhood, vista vision, a pair of wet, mobile lips on the screen, at least 8 feet long. On the corner, a blind man with one leg was selling pencils. He must have received a disability check, but it didn't feed his hunger for public agony. And he sat on the sidewalk, slack-jawed with a tin cup, his eyes turned upward in a look of blind, questing pathos. Half Job, half mole. Would a good Christ of Manhattan have restored his sight and 2/3 of his left leg? Or would he have healed his heart and left them there in his mutilated body? And what would that piece feel like? Makes you want, at this point, a quick cut or a reaction shot. The taxis rivered up 6th Avenue. A little sunlight touched the steeple of the First Magyar Reformed Church. In fact, the clerk in the liquor store was appalled. No, he said, that Cabernet can't be drunk for another 5 years. Spring rain. Now the rain is falling freshly in the intervals between sunlight. A Pacific squall started no one knows where, drawn west as the drifts of warm air make a channel. It moves its own way, like water or the mind, and spills this rain passing over. The Sierras will catch it as the last snow flurries before summer, observed only by the wakened marmots at 10,000 feet. And we will come across it again as larkspur and penstemon sprouting along a creekside above Sonora Pass next August. That's not the end of it. The gray jays of the mountains eat larkspur seeds, which cannot propagate otherwise. To simulate the process, you have to soak gathered seeds all night in the acids of old coffee and then score them gently with a very sharp knife before you plant them in the garden. You might use what was left of the coffee we drank in Lisa's kitchen visiting. There were orange poppies on a table in a clear glass vase, stained near the bottom to the color of sunrise. The unstated theme was the blessedness of gathering and the blessing of dispersal. It made you glad for beauty like that, casual and intense, lasting as long as the poppies last. And for kitchens, and fresh starts, and talking to friends. James had never seen the coast before. Carolyn was leaving for England. Late spring. And then in mid-May, the first morning of steady heat, the morning leaf says when you wake up, put on shorts, and that's it for the day. When you walk outside, when you pour coffee and walk outside, blinking in the sun. Strawberries have appeared in the markets and peaches will soon. Squid is so cheap in the fish stores, you begin to consult Japanese and Italian cookbooks for the various and ingenious ways of preparing ika and calamari. And because the light will enlarge your days, your dreams at night will be as strange as the jars of octopus you saw once in a fisherman's boat under the summer moon. And after swimming, white wine. And the sharing of stories before dinner is prolonged because the children in the neighborhood, because the relations of the children in the neighborhood have acquired village intensity, and the stories take longer telling. And there are nights when the fog rolls in that nobody likes. Hey, fog, the Miwok sang, who lived here first, you better go home, Pelican is beating your wife. And after dark, in the first cool hour, your children sleep so heavily in their beds, exhausted from play, it is a pleasure to watch them. Leaf does not move a muscle as he lies there. No, wait, it is Luke who lies there in his 8-year-old body. Leaf is taller than you are, and he isn't home. When he is, his feet will extend past the end of the mattress, and Kristen is at the corner in the dark, talking to neighborhood boys. Things change. There is no need for this dream-compelled narration. The rhythm will keep me awake, changing. Can you hear me in the back? Spring drawing 2. A man says lilacs against white houses, 2 sparrows, 1 streaked in a thinning birch, and can't find his way to a sentence. In order to be respectable, Thorsten Veblen said, desperate in Palo Alto, a thing must be wasteful, i.e., a selective adaptation of forms to the end of conspicuous waste. So we try to throw nothing away. As Keith, making dinner for us as his grandmother had done in Jamaica, left nothing. The kitchen was as clean at the end as when he started. Even the shrimp shells and carrot fronds were part of the process, and he said, when we tried to admire him, listen, I should send you into the chicken yard to look for a rusty nail to add to the soup for iron. The first temptation of Shakyamuni was desire, but he saw that it led to fulfillment and then to desire, so that one was easy. Because I have pruned it badly in successive years, the climbing rose has sent out among the pale pink floribunda a few wild white roses from the rootstock. Suppose, before they said silver or moonlight or wet grass, each poet had to agree to be responsible for the innocence of all the suffering on earth, because they learned in arithmetic during the long school days, that if there was anything left over, you had to carry it. The wild rose looks weightless. The floribunda are heavy with the richness and sadness of Europe as they imitate the dying, petal by petal, of the people who bred them. You hear pain singing in the nerves of things. It is not a song. The gazelle's head was turned. 3 jaguars were eating his entrails, and he was watching. This next one is called Russia in 1931, and it's the name of a book written by the Peruvian poet Cesar Vallejo, who published in Spanish in Paris in 1932. Vallejo is mestizo. He was a half Indian, half Spanish, Peruvian, and grew up in a little village in Peru, went to the capital to go to college, joined a party against the government, got thrown in jail, wrote his book of poems, got out of jail, went to Paris. It was the early 30s. He saw lots of Latin American workers in the foulest district of Paris, out of work. He joined the Communist Party, worked very hard for the party, worked very hard at organizing rent strikes among the Latin poor of Paris, and had great hopes for the Russian Revolution, and he went off to write as an assignment for the party to go off and write about Stalin's second 5-year plan. Yes, Stalin's second 5-year plan, which is essentially involved with the magic of electrification. That was the period when Stalin said communism is electrification, which is what Roosevelt was doing around here, electrifying the farms around Fresno. Which is what was happening in the developed world. Anyway, the year that he arrived in Russia was the last year that the Russian Jewish poet Osip Mandelstam was free. And I don't know if you know the story of Mandelstam. The brief version of the story is that he was a quite brilliant poet of the generation of the 20s who was not whose politics were different from. He held himself aloof from the politics of the revolution. And he had a different version, his own utopian version of city-state politics. And he wrote a poem against Stalin, which was quoted as Stalin, and he was hunted down, eventually arrested, put into an insane asylum, let loose, hunted down, and in 1932 arrested for the final time. Russia, 1931. The Archbishop of San Salvador is dead, murdered by no one knows who. The left says the right says provocateurs. And the families in the barrios sleep with their children beside them and a machete, or a rifle if they have one. And posterity is grubbing in the footnotes to find out who the bishop is, or waiting for the poet to get back to his business. Well, there's this. Her breasts are the color of brown stones in moonlight, and paler in moonlight, and that should hold them for a while. The bishop is dead. Poetry proposes no solutions. It says justice is the well water of the city of Novgorod, black and sweet. Cesar Vallejo died on a Thursday. It might have been malaria, no one is sure. It burned through the small town of Santiago de Chuco in his childhood. It may very well have flared in his veins in Paris on a rainy day. And 9 months later, Osip Mandelstam was last seen feeding off the garbage heap of a transit camp near Vladivostok. They might have met in Leningrad in 1931 on a corner. Two men about 40. They could have compared gray hair at the temple or compared reviews of Trilce and Tristia in 1922. What French they would have spoken. And what the one thought would save Spain killed the other. I am no wolf by blood, Mandelstam wrote that year. Only an equal could break me. And Vallejo, think of the unemployed. Think of the 40 million families of the hungry. Well, that leaves me stranded on the aureole of the memory of the... And I'm going to move on to something else. And you can buy my next book to find out how the man gets off that lonely island. I've been writing prose things that may be prose poems, may be poems only by generosity of definition. But the form is they're a paragraph long. And I only violated it once. And this is another way of response to the idea that I was singing the Dreams song. It raises the question of what is the world's song? And I had some idea that maybe the world sang in prose, which I no longer think, but when I started these, it was a working hypothesis. Museum. On the morning of the Katakovitz exhibit, a young man and woman come into the museum restaurant. She is carrying a baby. He carries the air freight edition of the Sunday New York Times. She sits in a high-backed wicker chair, cradling the infant in her arms. He fills a tray with fresh fruit, rolls, and coffee in white cups and brings it to the table. His hair is tousled. Her eyes are puffy. They look like they were thrown down into sleep and then yanked out of it like divers coming up for air. He holds the baby. She drinks coffee, scans the front page, butters a roll, and eats it in their little corner in the sun. After a while, she holds the baby. He reads the book review and eats some fruit. Then he holds the baby while she finds the section of the paper she wants and eats fruit and smokes. They've hardly exchanged a look. Meanwhile, I have fallen in love with this equitable arrangement and with the baby who cooperates by sleeping. All around them are faces Katakovitz carved in wood of people with no talent or capacity for suffering, who are suffering the numbest kinds of pain, hunger, helpless terror. But this young couple is reading the Sunday paper in the sun, the baby is sleeping, the green has begun to emerge from the rind of the cantaloupe, and everything seems possible. This one is 2 short paragraphs, and it's called Calm. If I were a healthier person, it would probably be 1 paragraph. And it came of, the 2 parts came of somebody saying, "How are you?" and my saying, "Pretty good," and then realizing later that I actually was feeling quite terrible in the way that you do, but I actually meant pretty good when I said pretty good. Calm, 1. September sun, a little fog in the morning, no sanctified terror. At night, Luke says, "How do you connect a B to an A in cursive?" He is bent to the task with such absorption that he doesn't notice the scarlatti on the stereo which he would, in other circumstances, turn off. He has said that chamber music sounds to him worried. I go out and look at the early stars. They glow faintly. Faintly, the mountain is washed in the color of sunset. At this season, a faded scarlet like the petals of the bougainvillea, which is also fading. A power saw somewhere in the neighborhood is enacting somebody's idea of more pleasure, an extra room or a redwood tub. It hums and stops, hums and stops. 2. In the dream, there was a face saying no, not with words, brow furrow, crow's feet, lip curl. No, it is forbidden to you. No. But it was featureless. You could put your hand through it and feel cold on the other side. It was not the father face saying no among the torsos and the pillars of aluminum, nor the mother's face weeping no, no, no at the gate that guards rage. It was not even the idiot face of the obedient brother tacking his list of 175 reasons why not on the greenhouse door. This face spits on archetypes, spits on caves, rainbows, the little human luxury of historical explanation. The meadow, you remember the meadow and the air in June, which held the scent of it as the woman in religious iconography holds the broken sun. You can go into that meadow, the light routed by a brilliant tenderness of green, a cool V carved by a muskrat in the blue-gray distance of the pond, black-eyed Susans everywhere. You can go there. I lived for a short time in a little village in England. And I always say, in case that sounds great, what my wife said about a small village, living in a small village in England, in case you're thinking I'm luckier than you. She said it was like an Agatha Christie novel with no murder in it. It was a little boring, not much of the time. Not to mention cold, extremely cold. Anyway, I'll read a couple of things from I will if I can find. Read a couple of things. Okay. Sure. Well, one of the things that happened when I started writing prose was that, and I started reading in the prose poem, and when I did, the first idea I got about what the prose poem was that they were all extremely nervous that it would sound like prose. So that is, that it would sound like exposition or narrative. So I found myself, instead of trying to write, quote, wildly imaginative things to prove that I wasn't writing prose, I found myself saying, well, how far could you go in the direction of prose and still feel like, in tone? Like, I mean, it was like a color to me. You know, like, well, it's obvious you're not supposed to use blue in this kind of, when you paint whatever it is. So let's see. Churchyard. This one is called Churchyard. Somerset Maugham said a professional was someone who could do his best work when he didn't particularly feel like it. There was a picture of him in the paper, a face lined deeply and morally like Auden's, an old embittered tortoise, the corners of the mouth turned down resolutely to express the idea that everything in life is small change. And what he said when he died, I'm all through. The clever young men don't write essays about me. In the fleshly world, the red tulip in the garden sunlight is almost touched by shadow and begins to close up. Someone asked me yesterday, are deer monogamous? I thought of something I had read. When deer in the British Isles were forced to live in the open because of heavy foresting, it stunted them. The red deer who lived in the Scotch Highlands 1,000 years ago were a third larger than the present animal. This morning, walking into the village to pick up the car, I thought of a roof where I have slept in the summer in New York, pigeons in the early morning sailing up Fifth Avenue and silence in which you imagine the empty canyons the light hasn't reached yet. I was standing on the high street in Shelford Village outside the fussy little tea shop, and I thought a poem with the quick, lice-ridden pigeons in it might end, "This is a dawn song in Manhattan." I hurried home to write it, and as I passed the churchyard, school was letting out. Luke was walking toward me, smiling. He thought I had come to meet him. That was when I remembered the car, when he was walking toward me through the spring flowers and the 18th century gravestones, his arms full of school drawings. He hoped not to drop in the mud. This one is called Conversion, and maybe it should be called The Shortest Way Out of England or something like that. Walking down the stairs this morning in the cold air, past the leaden glass window, past the Mansur coat of arms, I longed for California, and I thought I smelled laurel leaves. Riding an acacia limb in springtime, rivers of yellow pollen, wild fennel we cut in 6-inch lengths and threw at each other in the neighborhood wars, or crouched in thickets of broom shooting blue jays with BB guns. Wasseau, I read last week when I picked up a volume of Ponge in the bookshop on Rue Racine and thought of blue jays, and so bought the Ponge, thinking I would write grave, luminous, meditative poems. And walking across the bridge later past Notre Dame, I remembered boring Jack Chalane, who lived alone with his mother, the telephone operator, and always wanted to pretend that we were the children of Fatima, having a vision of the Virgin, and I would go along for a while, hoping to get him back to playing pirates. Vision of Jack kneeling under the fig tree, palms prayerfully touching, looking up awed and reverent into the branches where the fat green figs hung like so many scrotums among the leaves. Scrota, but they were less differentiated than that. Breasts, bottoms, the sexual ambiguity of flowers and fruits in French botanical drawings. Oh yes, sweet hermaphrodite peaches and the glister of plums. Well, that's really a poem about California, not about England. This one is, and it ends in the voice of, in a flat Cambridgeshire drawl, which I can't imitate very well. It's called Human Wishes, which somebody told me was what Samuel Beckett was going to call his collected works. This morning, the sun rose over the garden wall, and a rare blue sky leapt from east to west. Man is altogether desire, say the wise Upanishads. Worth anything, a blue sky, says Mr. Acker, the Shelford gardener. Not altogether. In the end, last night on television, the ethnologist and the cameraman watched with hushed wonder while the chimpanzee carefully stripped a willow branch and, with exact hand-eye coordination, inserted it into the anthill. He desired red ants. When they crawled slowly up the branch, he ate them, pinched between his long fingers as the zoom lens enlarged his face. Sometimes he stopped to examine one thoughtfully, as if he were a judge at an ant beauty contest. There was an empty place in the universe where that branch wasn't, and the chimp had filled it, as Erlene, finding no back on an old Welsh cupboard she had bought in Saffron Walden, imagined one there, and imagined both the cupboard and the imagined back against a kitchen wall in Berkeley, and went into town looking for a few pieces of 18th century tongue-and-groove pine to fill that empty space. I stayed home to write, or rather, stayed home and looked at a piece of paper thinking tongue and groove, as if language were a kind of moral cloud chamber through which the world passed and from which it emerged charged with desire. The man in the shop in Cambridge said he didn't have any old pine, but when Erlene went back after thinking about it to say she was sure she had seen some, the man found it right under his feet, which was puzzling. Mr. Acker, hearing the story, explained. You know, he said, an awful lot of fiddling goes on in those places. First time you went in, the governor was there. Second time he wasn't, so the chap sold you some scrap and he's a few quid in pocket. Imagine he's having a good time now with his mates at the pub. Or he might have put it on the horses at Newmarket. He might parlay it into a fortune. This is called Tall Windows. It's really about depression. It's about depression as a form of invasion, I think. I've come to think that that's what it's about. Tall windows. All day you didn't cry or cry out, and you felt like sleeping. The desire to sleep was light bulbs dimming when a powerful appliance kicks on. You recognize that. As in school, it was explained to you that pus was a brave army of white corpuscles hurling themselves at the virulent invader and dying. Riding through the Netherlands on a train, you noticed that even the junk was neatly stacked in the junkyards. There were magpies in the fields beside the watery canals, neat little houses, tall windows. In Leiden, on the street outside the university, the house where Descartes lived was mirrored in a canal. There was a pair of swans, and a sense that, without haste or anxiety, all the people on the street were going to arrive at their appointments punctually. Swans and mirrors and Descartes. It was easy to see how this European tranquility might produce a poet like Mallarmé, a middle-class art like symbolism. And you did not despise the collective orderliness, the way the clerks in the stores were careful to put bills in the cash register with the Queen's face facing upward. In the house next to the house where Descartes lived, a Jewish professor died in 1937. His wife was a Dutch woman of strict Calvinist principles, and she was left with 2 sons. When the Nazis came in 1939, she went to court and perjured herself by testifying that her children were conceived during an illicit affair with a Gentile. And when she developed tuberculosis in 1943, since she was going to die anyway, she traded passports with a Jewish friend and took her place on the train to the camps. Her sons kissed her goodbye on the platform. Eyes open. What kept you awake was a feeling that everything in the world has its own size, that if you could find its size among the swellings and diminishings, it would be calm and shine. This is about Berkeley, the gentrification of Berkeley, I think. And it's called, of all of California, I'm sure it's true here. It's called Quartet. What time is it? I didn't, it's 5 after, what time did I start? 7? Oh, okay. Quartet. The two couples having dinner on a Saturday night, it's late fall, in a dining room with oak-half paneling, are in their late 30s and stylish, but not slavishly so. The main course is French, loin of pork, probably with a North African accent, and very good. The dessert will be sweet and fresh, having to do with cream and berries. It is early fall, and it feels like a course. It is that substantial. They are interestingly employed. A professor of French, let's say, the assistant curator of film at a museum, a research director for a labor union, a psychologist, a journalist, a sculptor, an astronomer, etc. One of them believes that after death there is nothing, that our knowledge of this is a fluke, a gift or a joke, like knocking on doors as children sometimes do and disappearing, so that the pleasure has to be in imagining the dismay of the person who opens the door and finds the entryway empty. Another believes, dimly and from time to time, not so much in heaven as in a place where the dead will gather, embrace, and talk quietly, where losses will be made good. Another believes in the transmigration of souls, not the cosmic reform school of Indian religion, but an unplanned passage, rather like life in its mixture of randomness and affinity. The fourth believes in ghosts, and has felt that consciousness might take longer to perish than the body and linger sometimes a spectral and unfinished grief or unfinished happiness if that doesn't come to the same thing. They are not talking about this. They are talking about high school, children, travel, politics. They're honest enough to know more or less who is paying for their meal. 4 people, the women with soft breasts, the men with soft, ropey, external genitals, in chairs talking. It is probably the 3rd Saturday in September. Maybe they have had melon or a poached pear. The hostess, she has very large knuckles and is a very good amateur tenor, is pouring hot coffee into cream-colored cups. In the Bahamas, the doctor looked at her stitches thoughtfully, a tall, lean, white man with an English manner. "Have you ever watched your mum sew?" he asked. The fellow who did this hadn't. "I like to take a tuck on the last stitch. That way the skin doesn't bunch up at the ends. Of course, you can't see the difference, but you can feel it." Later, she asked him about the one-armed and one-legged black men she kept seeing in the street. "Diabetic gangrene, mostly. There really isn't more of it here than in your country, but there's less prosthesis. It's expensive, of course, and rather more of a shock when you come right down to it. Well, as we say, there's nothing colorful about the Caribbean." He tapped each black thread into a silver basin as he plucked it out. "Have you been to Haiti? Now there is a truly appalling place." This one, I'm just doing snapshots. This is I'm flipping through them. Nadine Gordimer among the Courbets at the Louvre. Nadine Gordimer, a South African novelist. Courbet is the painter who, sort of pre-impressionist painter, very powerful. And there's a room in the Louvre of these peasant interiors that he did, just massive and overwhelming. Nadine Gordimer among the Courbets at the Louvre. Someone else spotted her. I think that's Nadine Gordimer. And it was, the book jacket face and slacks and a cardigan sweater. The trimness and elegance of her figure were not surprising, or the head tilted at the angle of consideration, or the hauteur of the profile, or the gray streaks in the handsomely cut hair. What was surprising, my friend said, was she's got a great ass. And she did. It seemed somehow at odds with what must have been a thin and fretful quality in her childhood, which her prose had never quite got rid of in 30 years of writing. She was moving slowly from picture to picture of massive and darkening life. The heaviness of the paintings was an anthem, and she, though small, seemed a sturdy person in whom whose mind the riddle of, I've rewritten this recently. And it's obviously not ready. The heaviness was an anthem, and she seemed a sturdy person, though small. No, I got it wrong again. God damn it. On to the next poem. In whose mind birth had set blossoming a riddle of suffering. It's more or less what I wanted to say. This one is called Birthday Party. I'm just kind of maybe I'm getting near the end. I'll read three more of these. I'll read two more of these. And then I'll read one more poem in verse, and then we'll be through. This one is called Paschal Lamb. Find the version of it that is reliable. One of the places that this poem comes from is feeling like I was actually getting to the age where you had to do the work of a historian. When your students start saying, what were the 60s like? Paschal Lamb. Well, David said, it was snowing outside, and his voice contained many registers of anger, disgust, and wounded justice. I think it's fucking crazy, and I'm not going to be a sacrificial lamb. In Greece sometimes, when she walked on the high road above the sea back to her house from the little village in the dark, a friend told me, and the sky seemed immense, the moon terribly bright, she would wonder if her life had been lived so that it would be a fit gift. And there is that poor heifer in the poem by John Keats, all decked out in ribbons and flowers, no terror in the eyes, no uncontrollable slobber of mucus at the muzzle, because she doesn't understand the festivities. And years later, after David had quit academic life, he actually bought a ranch in Kentucky near a town called Pleasureville and began to raise sheep. When we visited that summer and the nights were shrill with crickets and the heat did not let up, we traded stories after dinner, and he told us again the one about his first teaching job and the vice president. When he bought the place, he had continued his subscriptions to The Guardian and the Workers' Vanguard, but they piled up in a corner unread. He had a mortgage to pay. He didn't know anything about raising animals for slaughter, and so he read The American Sheep Man, he said, with an intensity of concentration he had never even approximated when he was reading political theory for his PhD orals. The Vice President of the United States, after his term in office, accepted a position as lecturer in political science at the small college in his home district where David had taken his first job. The dean brought Hubert Humphrey around to introduce him to the faculty. When they came to David's office, the vice president, expensively dressed, immensely hardy, extended his hand, and David did not feel he could take it because he believed the man was a war criminal, and not knowing any other way to avoid the awkwardness, he said so, which was the beginning of his losing the job at that college. But that was the dean's doing. The vice president started to cry. He had the hurt look in his eyes, David said, of a kicked dog with a long, unblemished record of loyalty and affection. This man who had publicly praised the terror bombing of villages full of peasants. He seemed to David unimaginably empty of inner life if he could be hurt rather than affronted by a young man making a stiffly moral gesture in front of two men his father's age. David said he had never looked at another human being with such icy, wondering detachment. And he said that he didn't like the sensation. And so, in the high-ceilinged kitchen, the air drenched with the odor of clover, we remembered Vic Doino in the snow in Buffalo in the days when the war went on continuously, like a nightmare in our waking and sleeping hours. Vic had come to work flushed with excitement at an idea he had had in the middle of the night. He had figured out how to end the war. It was a simple plan. Everyone in the country, in the world, certainly a lot of Swedish and English students would go along, who was opposed to the war, would simply cut off the little finger on the left hand and send it to the president. Imagine, they would arrive slowly at first, the work of 2 or 3 maniacs. But the news would hit the papers, and the next day there would be a few more. And the day after that, more. And then on the 4th day, there would be thousands. And on the 5th day, clinics would be set up, organized by medical students in Madison, San Francisco, Stockholm, Paris, to deal with the surgical process safely and on a massive scale. And on the 6th day, the war would stop. It would stop. The helicopters at Viennois would sit on the airfields in silence like squads of disciplined mosquitoes. And peasants, worried and curious, because peasants are always worried and curious, would stare up into the unfamiliar silence of that blue, cirrus-drifted sky. And years later, we would know each other by those missing fingers. An aging Japanese businessman, minus a little finger on his left hand, would notice the similarly mutilated hand of his cab driver in Chicago, and they would exchange a fleeting, unspoken nod of fellowship. And it could happen. All we had to do to make it happen, Vic had said, while the water for tea hissed on the hot plate in David's chilly office, and the snow came down thick as cotton batting, was cut off our little fingers right now, take them down to the department secretary, and have her put them in the mail. One more of these, which is called A Story About the Body, if I can find it. This is real tacky, just shuffling through paper. I'll get through doing it. Well, I have about half of it here, Xerox, and I think I remember. Yeah. I think I can say the part that I don't have. The young composer, working that summer at an artist colony, had watched her for a week. She was Japanese, a painter, almost 60, and he thought he was in love with her. He loved her work, and her work was like the way she moved her body, used her hands, looked at him directly when she made amused and considered answers to his questions. One night, walking back from a concert, they came to her door and said, One night, walking back from a concert, they came to her door and she turned to him and said, "I think you would like to have me." I would like that too, but I must tell you that I've had a double mastectomy. And when he didn't understand, I've lost both my breasts. The music in his belly withered very quickly, and he made himself look at her when he said, "I'm sorry, I don't think I could." He walked back to his own cabin through the pines, and in the morning he found on his porch, when he woke up, a small blue bowl. It looked to be full of rose petals, but he saw, when he looked at it closely, she must have swept them from the corner of her studio, that underneath the petal it was full of dead bees. I think that's it. I don't think I left anything out. I didn't quite get the story right, but I think that's it.